Good evening, I'm Klaudia Czerwińska and you're watching World News Tonight live from Warsaw. Russian President Vladimir Putin has agreed to limit attacks on Ukraine but won't commit to a truce. Kremlin officials meanwhile added that a key to resolving the conflict is the complete suspension of intelligence sharing and military aid. More on that in just a moment, but first, the latest headlines. The German parliament has approved plans for a major increase in military spending. Poland and the Baltic nations plan to withdraw from the International Landmine Convention. Right-wing presidential candidate Karol Nawrocki applauds his own work while pretending to be someone else. President Vladimir Putin has committed in a phone call with Donald Trump to limit Russian attacks on Ukrainian energy assets, but declined to agree on a broader 30-day ceasefire as the U.S. had sought. Putin also imposed several conditions for a lasting ceasefire, including the suspension of arms and intelligence support for Ukraine. Our reporter Paweł Trzaskowski has the biggest takeaways from the phone call so far.
We're getting down to a
Donald Trump called it a big deal. The Kremlin, a normalization call. The long-awaited phone conversation between the US and Russian heads of state was held on Tuesday. It started an hour behind schedule, and the first reports indicate that ceasefire talks are advancing. This came from the White House press secretary right after the meeting ended.
This conflict should have never started and should have been ended long ago with sincere and good faith peace efforts. The leaders agreed that the movement to peace will begin with an energy and infrastructure ceasefire, as well as technical negotiations on implementation of a maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea, full ceasefire and permanent peace. These negotiations will begin immediately in the Middle East.
Right before the call, Donald Trump said that many elements of a final agreement have been agreed to, but much remains to be worked on, and that he and the Russian president will be talking about land and power plants. However, first statements did not provide details on both. The previous conversation between both leaders was held mid-February. As a result of this lengthy and highly productive call, to quote Trump, negotiations to end war in Ukraine were to be held immediately. And the following month was ripe with pivotal events. First came the infamous Oval Office spat.
Do you think that it's respectful?
You're either going to make a deal or we're out. And if we're out, you'll fight it out. I don't think it's going to be pretty.
The meeting resulted in US cutting off military aid and intelligence sharing to Ukraine. It was only restored last week when Kyiv agreed to a 30-day ceasefire after the US-Ukrainian talks in Saudi Arabia.
The best goodwill gesture the Russians can provide is to say yes. To say yes to the offer that the Ukrainians have made to stop the shooting, to stop the fighting, and get to the table.
But no definite yes has followed from the Kremlin.
But who will give orders to cease hostilities? And what will be the price of such orders? Do you imagine almost 2,000 kilometers of front line? Who will figure out who and when in the field of 2,000 kilometers had broken a ceasefire? And then, who will blame whom in violation of this agreement? These are many of the questions that need to be analyzed carefully by both sides.
Instead, Russian forces pushed on, forcing Ukrainian troops out of the territories in the Kursk region, an area Kyiv has been holding to for the last 7 months. Russia's main talking points ahead of any peace talks included guarantees that Ukraine won't join NATO, lifting sanctions on Russia, reducing the size of Ukrainian armed forces, and Kyiv ceding Crimea and its 4 easternmost administrative regions to Moscow. Ukraine, meanwhile, has said that any peace deal must include the return of Ukrainian territory to its pre-2014 borders. And the first reports from today's call indicate that reconciling these two stances remains a distant perspective.
The Trump-Putin call was a substantial stepping stone for progress on the Russia-Ukraine ceasefire deal. As the dust settles from an hours-long talk between the leaders of the U.S. and Russia, reactions have begun to come in from Ukraine. We now connect live to our Kyiv correspondent Oz Kataji to get the latest on what the response is so far to the conversation that could change the trajectory of this conflict. Good evening, Oz. So what are the latest reactions to the phone call? What can you tell us so far?
Well, President Zelensky is in Finland at the moment, but we do have breaking news. No response out of Kyiv at the moment, but Donald Trump has posted to his Truth Social site about that phone conversation he just had with Vladimir Putin, saying, "My phone conversation today with President Putin of Russia was a very good and productive one. We agreed to an immediate ceasefire on all energy and infrastructure with an understanding that we will be working quickly to have a complete ceasefire and ultimately an end to this very horrible war between Russia and Ukraine. This war would never have started if I were president. Many elements of a contract for peace were discussed, including the fact that thousands of soldiers are being killed, and both President Putin and President Zelensky would like to see it end. That process is now in full force and effect, and we will, hopefully, for the sake of humanity, get the job done." So a very positive spin on that conversation from Donald Trump. But the conditions that Donald Trump went into these talks were that he wanted a full ceasefire, and he's come away with it with very little in return from Moscow. Moscow is agreeing to a temporary cessation of hostilities on energy infrastructure, but that's a mutually beneficial situation, as are the prisoner swaps, because Ukrainians have been very effectively targeting Russian oil depots over the last few weeks, with the new announcement of a drone, a domestically produced Ukrainian drone that can reach more than 3,000 kilometers. So what Trump was hoping for in this hasn't been achieved. However, he is moving forward as if this is a very positive step. The problem being with these positions, while we don't have an official readout from Kyiv as to their position yet, much of it was discussed by Zelensky in the lead up to this phone conversation. He put it that Putin would not agree to a ceasefire and that he would put up barriers and conditions. And from what we understand of this conversation from the reporting so far, for these further conditions for a full ceasefire, Putin wants all sorts of things from the US. He wants them to stop intelligence sharing. He wants them to stop armaments being sent to Ukraine. So these huge conditions being put up by Putin, again, to avoid the ceasefire, the unconditional ceasefire that the Ukrainians have signed up to. It's very clear that Kyiv is not going to be happy about this and is going to make that known. We just await the question from Kyiv as to whether they're going to agree to this temporary cessation of hostilities on energy infrastructure, or they're going to reject it based on the fact that they agreed to an unconditional ceasefire and the Russians have rejected it in their conversation with Putin.
A lot of information is going to be coming from Kyiv in hours to come, so please keep us updated. That was Oz Kataji reporting live from Kyiv. Let's move to Germany now. A historic vote by the Bundestag will result in an amendment to the country's constitution, allowing the incoming government to increase the national budget deficit without limiting defense spending and aid to Ukraine. On top of that, a special fund of 500 million euros will be created to cover infrastructure modernization as well as climate protection. Our correspondent Ovidiusz Nicieja, who was in Berlin closely following the vote, has this next report.
The German parliament has paved the way for massive new investments in defense and infrastructure. Now, the softening of debt rules will also be subjected to a vote in the German Federal Council, or the Bundesrat. And if it passes, this could mean that Germany in the future could become a formidable military force, but also it could have a tremendous economic impact here, and not just here, but on all of Europe. Germany is Europe's biggest economy, and it has been stagnating in the past few years, and economists see this influx of new investment as a potential to revive the German economy and hence have also positive impact on the rest of the European Union. But not everyone is as optimistic. Right after the vote on amending the constitution, I spoke to the leader of Alternative for Germany, a far-right party which is in the opposition, and I asked the leader, Alice Weidel, about her reaction to the vote.
The result is a catastrophe, because Germany is right now on its way to high indebtedness. So we decided, or the German Bundestag, the parliament decided on huge amount of debt. So therefore, in the sum, it could add up to 1.5, 1.8 trillion. So therefore, it is a giant indebtedness, and this will thus have consequences on our debt rating.
But it's not just Germany which plans to arm itself. The European Union as a whole also wants to do this, and many people here in Germany, many politicians, believe that this money that Germany wants to allocate to its military needs to be spent here in Europe, in the European Union, to boost also European defense industry.
We in Europe have to do much more for our own security and defense. That means we need to spend more. We need to spend more effectively, and we need to spend more European. And that's why I welcome this plan of Commission President Ursula von der Leyen to rearm Europe. This is a step in the right direction.
Germany was also visited today by French President Emmanuel Macron, who has met with the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and they have exchanged their views on the war in Ukraine, but have also had an opportunity to discuss the upcoming summit of European leaders. From Berlin for TVP World, Ovidiusz Nicieja.
In a move that is meant to be a step towards bolstering defense efforts within the Baltic region, Poland, Latvia, Estonia and Lithuania have decided to withdraw from the Ottawa Convention, which bans the use of anti-personnel mines. TVP World's defense correspondent Marek Steele has more.
The Ottawa Treaty on Anti-Personnel Mines will no longer hinder the defense efforts of Poland, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia. The chiefs of defense of the four countries have issued a joint statement on the withdrawal from the treaty.
The reason is the direct threat, unabated attacks carried out in a hybrid way. For the time being, I hope that no other ways will ever happen, but that's why we must be strong and be ready for any solution. We cannot be limited in any way, because defending the homeland must be done at all costs.
Poland and Lithuania were among the more than 130 signatories of what is also known as the Mine Ban Treaty from 1997. Russia never signed it. The treaty's primary provision says
each state party undertakes never under any circumstances to use anti-personnel mines, to develop, produce, otherwise acquire, stockpile, retain or transfer to anyone, directly or indirectly, anti-personnel mines.
But experts say that the security environment has changed drastically since 1997.
Having in mind unpredictable behavior of Russian Federation and previously the ongoing aggression in Ukraine is a strong need to have a possibility and capabilities to install the anti-personnel mines along the borders.
Poland and the Baltic states are constructing a border reinforcement project along their frontiers with Russia and Belarus. The Baltic Defense Line and the East Shield in Poland are to consist of physical barriers, but in the event of an escalation, also landmines.
Anti-personnel mines are devastating, but most importantly, they are also protective to the countries that lay them on their national boundaries and borders. And so while it's a drastic step, it's a step that I believe was necessary and taken with the best intentions.
Anti-personnel mines are being used by Europe's adversaries, and so are cluster munitions banned by the Dublin Convention. Countries of NATO's eastern flank are considering withdrawing from this treaty as well.
The era of the peace dividend is long gone. The security architecture that we relied on can no longer be taken for granted. The age of spheres of influence and power competition is well and truly back.
The defense of the eastern flank of NATO depends on mutual assistance. As Poland enters the last 2 months leading up to the presidential election, the candidate supported by the conservative Law and Justice Party has cast doubt on whether Poland should defend its Baltic allies.
I subscribe to the rule that allies only defend those who can defend themselves.
Security has become one of the main topics in the election campaign, with the government recently announcing work on a plan for voluntary military training for all adult Poles.
A confrontation between migrants and border officials on the Latvian-Russian border has led to an executive decision by the Latvian government to restrict access to the country's border checkpoints with Belarus and Russia. The officials believe increased migrant activity is not an isolated case, but a part of a hybrid warfare tactic by Latvia's neighbors. Zuzanna Jurek reports.
Latvian Border Control has announced it will close several checkpoints on the eastern border, including the Paterniki checkpoint on the border with Belarus, as well as Terechovo and Grebnevno on the border with Russia. This decision came following confrontation between the border officials and migrants who are approaching the border. According to the intelligence, this was unlikely to be an isolated incident.
During the interviews with them, it became clear that there were risks of group gatherings, quite large groups, and they can register in an organized manner.
Simultaneously, neighboring Poland observed a significant increase in illegal border crossing attempts.
A record for this year was set yesterday. That's nearly 180 attempts to illegally cross the border. The attempts are very often forcible, aggressive. Migrants with stones, tree branches, trying to pave their way to Western Europe.
Together with the latest recorded crossing attempts, the total of 1,100 crossings recorded in March 2025 is more than a double of that in February. This raises the question of which forces are at play when it comes to these incidents.
Putin, or rather through his vassal Lukashenko, is beginning to stir up the situation on the border of the European Union and, of course, NATO countries.
Since 2021, Poland has consistently warned its European and NATO allies that the sudden influx of migrants on Europe's borders with Belarus and Russia is no coincidence, rather a tool of hybrid warfare straight out of the Kremlin's toolbox.
We know very well how Lukashenko, Putin, the smugglers and human traffickers use the right of asylum.
Now, experts warn that with the closing of Latvia's border crossing, the influx experienced by its Polish neighbors is likely to climb even further.
It is possible that soon there will be some actions by Belarusian and Russian services at NATO eastern flank borders. And specifically, instrumentalization of migration is a useful tool for Russia and Belarus to play disinformation campaigns, because they are creating the chaos situation, they are deepening polarization inside European Union.
Poland has, however, been at the forefront of fortifying its borders, and Europe is following suit. Just last week, the European Commission voted in favor of classifying Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk's flagship security project, the Eastern Shield, a project of common interest.
And now to the Middle East, where the Israel-Hamas ceasefire has failed, as according to the Israeli defense minister, Hamas did not release the hostages. Israel launched a wave of airstrikes on the Gaza Strip early on Tuesday, instructed by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Gaza's health ministry has reported that the attacks killed at least 400 people, many of them children. The Israeli Prime Minister says he instructed the military to take, quote, strong action against Hamas in Gaza, as there was no progress in talks to extend the ceasefire. Israeli officials say the operation is expected to expand. Negotiations on the second phase of the ceasefire were scheduled to begin in early February. During the first phase, Israeli hostages were released in exchange for Palestinians imprisoned by Israel. Egypt, Qatar, and the United States were mediating talks on the next phases. However, the White House said it had been consulted on and supports Israel's latest strikes. A leading contender for Poland's presidency has a secret identity. Karol Nawrocki, who's running for the top office with backing from the main opposition party Law and Justice, was revealed on Monday to have used a pen name to write a book about a prominent gangster. He also appeared incognito on a local TV channel to promote the book and said the historian who inspired him to write the biography was Karol Nawrocki. Our chief political correspondent Aaron Damon reports.
Meet Tadeusz Bata, the biographer of a mafia boss in northern Poland.
In your book, you refer to the work of historian Dr. Karol Nawrocki.
Yes, he is actually the historian who inspired me to do my work.
That's Bata in a TVP interview 7 years ago, with his voice changed and face blurred, as he explains his book was inspired by Karol Nawrocki, the current presidential candidate, backed by the opposition right-wing Law and Justice Party. On social media, Nawrocki lauded Bata for his work and recommended it. But there's one problem. It can now be revealed Tadeusz Bata is Karol Nawrocki.
It was a situation in which Tadeusz Batyr, that is the literary pseudonym, could only refer to one source, as there was only one academic. At the time, I was changing jobs, and I didn't want to engage the Museum of the Second World War in Gdańsk in the work I was conducting.
In fact, Tadeusz is Nawrocki's middle name, and Batyr means warrior in the Kazakh language.
To me, it sends a very dubious message for a candidate that represents the right wing, law and order, you would say. It doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel very coherent.
It comes as Nawrocki flails in the polls, trailing centrist frontrunner Rafał Trzaskowski, and more crucially, sitting neck and neck with far-right Sławomir Mencen, who was previously seen as a dark horse. A poll out this week puts them in a statistical tie. Mencen even spent some of Tuesday in the presidential palace, meeting current President Andrzej Duda, who is an ally of law and justice and cannot run again after 2 terms in office.
I am very grateful to the president for giving me some good advice, which I hope will be useful for me in the coming months and years.
So can Nawrocki, a Eurosceptic with limited political experience, still get across the line?
Within the right-wing scene in Poland, we see a number of contenders for this vast electorate.
Internal power politics at play in a presidential race with much at stake. Aaron Darman, TVP World.
After days of waiting, the much-anticipated call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin has finally taken place. A lot was expected of this meeting as the world was carefully watching where today's events would lead and how much closer they would bring Ukraine and Russia to an actual tangible ceasefire. Joining me now to dissect what we know about the call and its consequences so far is Julia Smolowska, head of Globsec Kyiv and an expert with 15 years of diplomatic service at the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry. Good evening, and thank you for joining me on the program.
Good evening, ma'am.
Let's take a look what's been happening. President Vladimir Putin committed in a phone call with Donald Trump to limit Russian attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure, but declined to agree to a broader 30-day ceasefire, the one that U.S. in fact sought. What do you think does this signal, and does Russia actually want to reach that ceasefire?
I think that right now we're having strong evidence of completely the opposite, because the Russian statement says that Putin has immediately ordered to suspend all attacks on Ukraine and critical infrastructure. And right now we're being heavily covered by the drone attacks in Kyiv, and you can even hear this, probably some explosions or some sounds on the background right now. So this is the clear evidence how Putin is actually determined to act in good faith, how he claims, and to actually achieve this ceasefire.
Do you think that Putin, in this situation with the drone attack that you just mentioned, is he playing for time? What's the next step?
I don't know what's his logic or his explanation of this might be, because it's already happened after the call, after the both sides issued these statements, and Donald Trump saying that he received this confidence of Russia willing to act in goodwill. So I don't know. We just need to wait and to see. So basically, they might explain that it was about no attacks on critical infrastructure and energy, but not on civilians. So this is how they might explain this. But actually, we just got the report that half of one of the small towns had been just cut off because of the drone attacks of electricity. So.
There's been pieces of information floating from the Kremlin. We also heard from Kirill Dmitriev, Putin's business envoy, and he said, I quote, "Under the leadership of President Putin and President Trump, the world has become a much safer place today." Your commentary to this statement?
You definitely need to read both readouts of White House and of Kremlin and to compare them, because the White House one, it's more or less balanced objectively, and it actually states about the stages, how they would like to go ahead, like having this confidence building measures of ceasefire on attacks on critical infrastructure, then technical negotiations on security in Black Sea region, leading to basically the full ceasefire and eventual lasting peace, whereas the Kremlin side pretends to show that it's up to two leaders to decide on and around Ukrainian crisis, and always been stressing this kind of like the two of them, like US and Russia, working on this crisis, leaving the Ukrainian aside. So this is very interesting reading, and Russians obviously trying to present with this the similarity and commonality with the American side, that they sharing the common views on the conflict. For instance, Russian statement also mentions the similar voting that they had recently in the United Nations on the crisis in Ukraine, like Russians mentioned. So it's definitely clear big difference on how these talks are presented by Russian side and by the American side. And basically, which is also very interesting, the recent statement of Donald Trump on what's going on in these talks. He says that this horrible war between Russia and Ukraine has to be brought to the end, whereas Russians deliberately trying to present this as the internal crisis in Ukraine.
Actually, I will have to correct you on this a little bit, because we in fact did receive some statements from Mr. Trump as of 7:51 p.m. Local time. And this is my next point in this conversation. We heard process is now in full force and effect, and we will hopefully, for the sake of humanity, get the job done, as well as we will be working quickly to have a complete ceasefire. So nothing really concrete, but do you think that those statements could actually point at Donald Trump suggesting that we are getting closer to that ceasefire?
Yes, they definitely have this assessment, this impression from these talks with Putin that they are one step closer to ceasefire. But again, the first concrete step which had been agreed is immediate ceasefire on attacks on critical infrastructure, which hasn't been followed from Russian side. So it remains to be seen what might be the next statement of Donald Trump after he gets this information that actually, after these promises, the ceasefire, the Russian actually attacked Ukraine again. And it is with the same message, with the same his post on social media that I referred to, that he labels this as the war between Russia and Ukraine, not as internal conflict in Ukraine like Russia presents it.
One of the conditions of the ceasefire, something that we've mentioned here in our program earlier today, is withholding military and intelligence aid to Ukraine. This doesn't seem like a very fulfillable condition leading to a ceasefire, is it?
It was not about the condition of ceasefire. If you read carefully, even the Kremlin statement, they say that the key precondition for the settlement of the conflict would be to have the military demobilization suspended in Ukraine, military assistance suspended, and not exchange of intel data and support Ukraine with intel data. They are not talking about the ceasefire condition. They're talking about this potential, like a peace settlement or political and diplomatic track. And this is why, for the ceasefire, what they raised and they put it in their statement from Kremlin. Like the first is they have some justifiable, actually, concerns how this monitoring of a ceasefire would be controlled, because the length of the front line is much wider, much longer than it used to be in 2014. This is the right technical question, but then they say that there is no trust and that the risk that Kyiv regime, like they label us, would inevitably breach the ceasefire because of the incidents before. So Russians are basically perversing the situation from down to top, just to try to present that Kyiv is the root of the problem, not Russia one.
Last but not least, if Putin were actually to agree to a ceasefire and withhold certain conditions that would be agreed on both sides, do you think that there is a chance that Russia would actually use that opportunity to strike again?
Of course, I think that because of the complexity of the issue, it's definitely there should be very viable solution how the ceasefire should be monitored, because this is the key question, and Russians might be very, very instrumental to breach it and to do everything to blame Ukraine on that. So we should be prepared that Russians will be playing very mean games when it comes to actually following the ceasefire.
Thank you so much, Yulia Osmolovska, director at Globsec Kyiv. It was a pleasure to have you on the program. And so this would be all for now here on World News Tonight, but please do stay tuned. We're back in just a moment here on TVP World to bring you more latest news and features.